Hello, and welcome to this screencast on the differential diagnosis of aphasia. You should first view the video on what aphasia is before you view this video. It will be essential that you understand the key components of aphasia before you try to undertake the differential diagnosis of aphasia. So, the differential diagnosis of aphasia has been debated over the years. There are some that say it's not necessary to differentially diagnose aphasia, and there are some that say it should be differentially diagnosed. I guess I fall in the middle. I think that it's not necessarily essential to the treatment of aphasia, but it does help the clinician quite a bit to understand what kind of aphasia the individual has, because it allows you access to the literature. Within the literature, you're going to read articles where it's discussed that the people within this study had transcortical motor or transcortical sensory or mixed transcortical aphasia. And therefore, it's going to be important that you understand whether or not the people who are represented in the study are similar to the people who are that you are seeing at this particular, or the person that you're seeing at this particular time. The first thing that you have to do, the most essential thing that you have to do before you can differentially diagnose aphasia, is to assure that you have aphasia. If you try to run a person through the differential diagnosis of aphasia, and they in fact have apraxia, or they have dysarthria, or they have an agraphia or an alexia, then you will be taking them through an invalid process. The process is not valid because they don't have aphasia. So first, you must determine that they have a multimodality loss of language. That is, reading is affected, writing is affected, speaking is affected, and listening or auditory comprehension is affected. You have to have those four things in place. You have to already know about those four things, and a standard aphasia battery will allow you to know those four things. And if those four things are in fact affected, then you can move forward with the differential diagnosis of what type of aphasia it is. This is key. There are four things we're going to look at in the differential diagnosis of aphasia, and really there's only three. So the other thing about this is people think it's hard, but it's not hard. It's really quite simple. There are only three major things you're looking at. First, you're going to assure that the person has a word finding error. That's kind of the same as saying be sure that the person that you're seeing has aphasia. The cardinal feature of aphasia is word finding deficit. So that was depicted in Darley's definition as the reduction in availability of vocabulary. That's kind of like saying word finding deficit. So that's the cardinal feature. So the first thing that you need to assure is that you have aphasia. The second thing that you're going to look at is the person's fluency. That is the fluency with which they produce speech. That's not the same as stuttering. The next thing that you need to look at is auditory comprehension, and the last thing that you will look at is repetition. So auditory comprehension, repetition, fluency, and assure that you have aphasia. So if you do have a person with aphasia, and you look at their fluency and you find that they are non-fluent, they either have global, isolation aphasia, which is also called mixed transcortical aphasia. Take a note of that. It's also called mixed transcortical aphasia, Broca's aphasia, or transcortical motor aphasia. If they have aphasia and you determine they're fluent, they either have Wernicke's, transcortical sensory, conduction, or anomic aphasia. Once you've determined whether they're fluent or non-fluent, let's say they're fluent, then you would go to the area of comprehension. If this is a person who's non-fluent and has less comprehension, note, this doesn't say normal, it says less, then they either have global or isolation, also known as mixed transcortical aphasia. If they're non-fluent and have more comprehension, they either have Broca's or transcortical motor aphasia. So if this person has aphasia, is non-fluent, has less comprehension, and poor repetition, they have global aphasia. If this person has aphasia, they're non-fluent, they have less comprehension, but good repetition, then they have isolation or mixed transcortical aphasia. If they have aphasia and they're non-fluent, but they have more comprehension. Note, this does not say normal or not normal. It says more or less. If this is aphasia, there will be some deficit in auditory comprehension. You have to remember that. So this isn't, is it intact or is it not intact? It's never intact. But if they have more comprehension, then they have Broca's or transcortical motor aphasia. If they have aphasia, they're non-fluent. They have more comprehension but poor repetition. It's Broca's. If they have aphasia, they're non-fluent. They have more comprehension but good repetition. They have transcortical motor aphasia. The same then would apply to the other side of the diagram. If they have aphasia and it's fluent, and they would have Wernicke's, transcortical sensory conduction, or anomic aphasia. If they had less comprehension, it would be Wernicke's or transcortical sensory. If they had more comprehension, it would be conduction or anomic. If they were fluent and they had less comprehension and poor repetition, they would have Wernicke's. If they were fluent with less comprehension and good repetition, they had transcortical sensory aphasia. If they were fluent with more comprehension, remember, not normal, just more, they would have, and they had poor repetition skills, they would have conduction. If they were fluent with more comprehension and good repetition, they would have anomic aphasia. So this is the basic differential diagnosis of aphasia. If you use the Western Aphasia Battery, the scores on the Western Aphasia Battery can be used to help you classify people with cortical lesions. This classification system only applies to cortical aphasias. Those people who have subcortical aphasias should not be put into this category. So if the lesion site is subcortical, you would not put the person into this paradigm. So now you might ask, well, how am I going to tell if the person has good or poor auditory comprehension, good or poor repetition? So the aphasia diagnostics profile, the ADP, was put together by Helms Estabrooks and colleagues. And to do their work, they used a paradigm for determining these things, and I think they're a good rule of thumb to use. So in the standardization of the ADP, those people with an average phrase length of 9 words or better were found to be a cutoff score for classifying the output as frankly fluent. So an average phrase length of 9 words or more. That's typically defined as what one would utter on a single breath. So on a single breath, if the person is uttering 9 words or more, their output would be determined to be frankly fluent. Now, this output may not make sense. So in the case of fluent aphasia, what's being said may not be sensical, but there are 9 or better words on a single breath group. So it might sound something like, well, I was going to be there, but I wasn't quite sure if it was that thing that I was supposed to be doing because I was going to, but then I couldn't because it was such a big conventual. You can see it's quite fluent. You can see that on one breath group I did several words. So persons with frankly non-fluent output had a best average length of 0 to 5 words. So this is how we're going to differentiate those with who are frankly non-fluent and those who are frankly fluent. 0 to 5, non-fluent. 9 or more, frankly fluent. Those in the middle were considered to be borderline fluent, and those were people ranging from 6 to 8 words. 6 to 8 words. This group was found to have an etiology that was subcortical in nature. So you might have thought, oh gosh, how will I know? If you do this and you find that the person's kind of in the middle, then they may have a subcortical lesion. Not necessarily, but may. Again, it's not black or white, but may. Phrase length, now listen to this, is determined by the number of words produced in a breath group or without significant pause. So if the person pauses, stops to think, that counts as stopping. In determining phrase length in aphasia, Estabrooks and colleagues feel it's best to obtain the average of the 3 longest meaningful utterances across 3 conditions. So if you were going to do this without an aphasia battery, you would want to use some kind of speech output that had these 3 conditions in it. The 3 conditions are response to an open-ended question like, what happened to you? A description of a picture seen. You've probably seen those before. Some classic ones are called the cookie theft picture from the Boston Diagnostic Aphasia Examination, or the general store picture in the aphasia diagnostics profile, the kite flying picture from the Western Aphasia Battery. And the last condition is a response to a question of a historical or emotional significance. What can you tell me about President Kennedy, or do you remember September 11th, 2001? What happened? You take those 3. You would get a speech sample on those 3. You would find the 3 longest utterances in those 3. You would find the average of the 3 longest utterances, and that's what you would put on this scale of 0 to 5, 9 or more, or borderline fluent in the middle. For auditory comprehension then, Estabrooks and colleagues say that aphasiologists refer to the ability to decode verbal input as auditory comprehension. It's rarely entirely preserved in aphasia. According to Darley's definition, we would say it's never entirely preserved. And we are going to then compare whether or not it's good or poor or on par with the speech production. So this is your ability to encode language. This is your ability to say things. So your ability to understand, if it's less than what you can say, your auditory comprehension is relatively poor. If what you say is less than what you auditorily comprehend, then your auditory comprehension is relatively good. So if you were producing an average phrase length of let's say 5 words, and I asked you to point to pictures, and I said point to the flower, point to the tree, point to the car, point to the book, and on single auditory comprehension tasks you were only about 60% accurate, but you're producing 5 words at a time, then your auditory comprehension is poorer than your expression, because you can encode 5, but you can only decoding 60% of 1. So it's still a little bit of a comparison. You still have to use clinical judgment, but the idea here is that you're comparing to speech production. The same is true for repetition. To determine repetition, you're going to determine the ability to repeat weighed against the ability to produce similar speech units in conversation. So if you're producing 3 speech units as an average length in conversation, or your 3 best, but you can only repeat 2 words at a time, when you get to 3 words at a time you start to fall apart, then your repetition would be poorer than your speech production, and we would say your repetition is poor. So the standard bearer here is that when we're making comparisons for auditory comprehension and repetition, we first have to know what the speech production is like. And the comparison is always to the speech production. It's not our general guess. It's not what we decide. It's not what we think. We're going to compare it to the speech output. That's how we're going to kind of guide ourselves in making these decisions. Otherwise, you might rate somebody as having poor repetition, and I would say it was relatively good. If we have some kind of guideline, it helps us to be more consistent. When we're more consistent, we're more reliable. When we're more reliable, we get better results. So these are the ways that we differentially diagnose aphasia. These are the key ideas or key ways of differentially diagnosing aphasia. Remember that some people will choose not to differentially diagnose aphasia. In some cases, people are going to use the terms receptive aphasia and expressive aphasia. This is a personal bias. I do not like those terms. All aphasia is both expressive and receptive. So if you're using the "and" definition of aphasia, I don't know what a receptive aphasia is. Does it mean that your receptive language is better, or does it mean that it's worse than your speech production? There isn't a standard definition for those, so I'm not a fan of those. I am a big fan, though, of this classification system that is called the Boston classification system. And this system is what's typically used when you're reading research articles. I hope that you have found this screencast to be helpful, and remember that you may need to do some examples of these on quizzes or tests.